Thank you very much, Casper. Yeah, so welcome to this talk around Backstage, developer portals, sustaining growth, and enabling developers. So the agenda for today is these 4 items. We're going to set the stage at first, then we're going to find an audience, we're going to do some performance, and then we're going to look into the next steps. Firstly, just short around me. I am Bjørn and I'm a platform engineer at Lunar. I love everything developer experience, and that's really what motivates me in the daily work that I do at Lunar. I am one of the co-creators of the Lunar development platform since 2017, so in the very early days, and I'm a frequent contributor to several CNCF projects, including Backstage and Linkerd. So before we get too far into this, let's just try to set the stage. So Lunar is in fintech, or a bank at least. We have just short of 500 developers, employees. We have offices in 4 countries, and there's a couple of other details here, but the main thing is that we have technology hubs in 3 of these offices. So we got quite a lot of developers across quite a set of locations. Just shortly, here is a graph of the headcount that we've been going through the last couple of years. So at the lower left side, we can see 2015 when it all started. Back then we were named Lunar. And then this is the end of year headcounts over the years. As you can see, in the last couple of years, we have growth tremendously, and it's been quite the journey, both on a developer platform side, but also just as an organization scaling so much. Over the years, it's really been a 2 times increase of headcount year by year. So really insane growth. And hopefully today we can share some of the things that we've done to enable our developers in this massive growth. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to May. So May is a developer here at Lunar, or at least she's a persona of a developer. She's just starting and is very excited to get going. So during the interviews, May have gotten the perception that Lunar is working mostly in Go as a programming language. We are sourcing all our source code in GitHub, which are modern technologies. She's excited. This is going to be a great introduction. The first day, she's going to hear all things around GitHub and Go, but then it turns out that there's more. So as the day goes by, she finds out that maybe there's some Bitbucket in there as well. Oh, and it's actually not only Go that we develop in. We also have some Node.js in there, developed with TypeScript. We have some Java around the corners, and Jenkins is just crunching all the jobs to make sure that everything is in good quality and builds as it should. Well, time goes by, and you can't really do anything in a microservice if you don't communicate. So it turns out there's more stuff to know. So now here comes gRPC, here comes GraphQL, here comes RabbitMQ. So more things that May needs to wrap her head around in the beginning of this. And well, the journey just keeps on going, because of course we need to host these things somewhere. So here comes the clouds, and we are running things in all the major clouds here in Azure, AWS, Google Cloud. Then we have Kubernetes running across everything of this. And of course there's a service mesh in there as well. So things are getting, well, are we getting out of hand? I think we are. But then again, there's more. Here comes the observability stack, where we use open source tools like Grafana and Prometheus and Jaeger tracing. We also have some proprietary software from Humio and Snyk around log management and security scanning. And of course, there is more. Here comes the infrastructure parts of it. We have some Google Deployment Manager. We got some Atlantis running Terraform, some Spacelift running Terraform. We got Terraform itself. Just what is this? And then there's Crossplane in the mix as well to provision infrastructure. So there's all these different kinds of things. And we haven't even talked about things like blocking, static blocks. We haven't talked about task management and Trello and Jira, Service Desk. And yeah, well, we can see where it goes. May is not that happy as she was in the beginning. And this is due to having a huge platform with a lot of things, moving parts especially. And you can't really expect any one developer to comprehend all of this. So we need to figure out what to do. So next up is to find out who are the audience we're going to go for, what can we try to solve, and how we're going to do it. So let's start with the what's. So there are a lot of questions that we can try to ask, or a lot of questions that we hear when new developers start. And some of them could be these. So what things do we have? So May just started in Lunar, and she's like, well, I'm going to do something. I want to be productive, and I don't want to rebuild things. So what do we have already? That's a fair question, I think, but it might not be that easy to answer, really. Next up is that if you actually find these things, then who owns them? Well, what can you expect of these teams? What is the life cycle of these things? And from there on, it might be relevant to ask, well, what do these things talk to? So what is the intercommunication things around all the stuff Lunar, and how can I work with this? Moving up, we're gonna have to ask things like, what can I even do with this? So there might be something called a PDF generator. So I know now that some team owns it. I know that some service is talking to it, but how can I use it in my work? How can I be enabled by this shared service? And then, of course, how do I even do it then? I maybe find out that this is an HTTP service and I can do some requests against it, but how do I do it in practice? What are the authentication schemes? And so forth. So a lot of what's and why's and how questions that really comes down to all the things that isn't obvious when you start in a new company. At Lunar, we've been over the years collecting these, as we tend to call them, pains, because they're usually just small things that could be better or could be better documented here and there, and trying to stay ahead of this and collect all of these pains continually really helps the development platform team to really know where does the shoe hurt, where can we set in next, and for who is this the most urgent thing. So we've been collecting these pains continually over the years and really found out that there are especially some places where we need to do better, and that's a great guiding line. So of course, these are just the what's, and they might be from May, but they could be from any stakeholder in the Lunar organization. So the who's, who are these people who's going to work with us? What are the roles and what can they do? There are so many stakeholders when you're running a large tech company, and you can't really make everyone happy, but also you can't really make every single one of them happy at once. So you want to select some of them and decide that these are the ones that we can create most value for upfront. So just to name a few, there are app developers doing mobile apps. There might be backend developers doing services or core services like infrastructure or integrations into external systems. There might be architects trying to guide the tech organization into how should we organize the software and where should ownership be and stuff like that. We might have some auditors who try to fiercely figure out where is this GDPR requirements going to be applicable, or where is sensitive data stored in what databases and what are the permissions around them and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different personas that we can take out and figure out. Maybe we want to do something about this. As we've collected these pains over the years, what we really found out at that point, and this was, I think, 1.5 years ago, where we saw most pains was around the backend development. And as you might know, Lunar is a modern bank with a cloud-native infrastructure. That means that we have a lot of fairly modern technologies. We run things atop of Kubernetes, and there's a lot of different moving parts when it comes to usual development. And we just saw that backend developers were really struggling to figure out all of these things. And as we just saw with May, there are a lot of technologies in place here just to enable you. And having an expectation that this might be everything you need to know, and you actually need to know something about everything, is just too much. So we set out to see if we can figure out something around this. Could we figure out a solution? And luckily for us, something popped up on the internet Backstage appeared on the Spotify organization at GitHub. And Backstage was coming out of Spotify as a tool that they've been using for several years around enabling their developers. Lunar is already built at top of some of the ideas of Backstage and autonomous teams, from Spotify around autonomous teams, where we try to gather developers or teams into specific squads that can be self-owning around, let's say, a feature or a domain that they need to deliver on. And there shouldn't be that too much coupling to different teams, which is also much of the ideas around DevOps and just managing your own stuff and owning everything you do. So Backstage comes along. It looks prominent. It got some of the ideas that we've looked to. So next up, we're going to see a couple of screenshots just from the web page. So the landing page says it's an open platform for building developer portals. And as I see it, it's like an application framework that enables with some ease to do front-end and back-end development against external systems and really figure out how to do this without building it ourselves. So it comes as a framework that sets up everything we need to know, like authentication and user management and stuff like that, without being too opinionated, but still being enough opinionated to move us forward and not having the platform team spend too much time on setting things up. As we scroll down the page, one of the first things that comes into view is the Backstage software catalog. And if we think back to some of the questions that we asked, it was around what do we even have in Lunar, or who owns what? And here comes the software catalog, an index of all the components or APIs and stuff like that exists in Lunar. So if we could get all our information into this system, we might actually be able to, with quite some ease, to answer some of these questions around ownership, descriptions and documentation around specific services. So maybe answer all of them. That could be nice. We scroll a bit further and we find the docs-like code, or the tech docs feature. That is, write some markdown and get it beautifully rendered with mkdocs and serve it inside Backstage. And this was like, how do I do specific things? So back to the example around the PDF generator. The team that built this service might have put in some time to document how I should use this, but they're usually developers and they like to write code and check that into source control. So having the documentation in Markdown really enables them to do as they used to do, but still get a nice front end to it in Backstage and get it served and get search indexes and stuff like that. So this sounds interesting. This could help with a couple of the last questions. And then, of course, one of the last questions was, how do I even do it? And here comes software templates, which is part of the core system of Backstage, where you can set up specific workflows or template. How do I create a new service, and what stuff should be done when I do so, or if I need access to a specific database, how can I get access to it? We can use this to create some nice visual guides and forms to get access in a nice way without having to reinvent stuff, which was really nice. So at this point, we were like, well, Backstage might be able to help us. We might actually be able to use this product, take it in, and get some value from the get-go. So we started exploring what could we do with it. And we had some ideas, of course, but we didn't want to sit down and start implementing anything, because what if the ideas were not relevant? And we also needed to figure out which of these ideas were the most valuable to start with. So we did some different mockups, and this is an example of a squad overview. So here it's a landing page for my squad. I'm gonna get in here in the morning and see, all right, I got a 99.97% success rate on my APIs. That's good. I got a couple of CVEs that's detected by Snyk. All right. We got some 500 errors that we might want to look into. Maybe I should start with that over a cup of coffee. So this could be like an entry point for the developer to really just start the day off. We have a widget on the right side around the pulse. So what has the team been doing the last couple of days? If you're a distributed team, this might be really valuable around just having a sense of what each other do if you don't have daily stand-ups or something like that to really just fill each other in. So these were some of the ideas that we explored. It could also be the ideas around, if I select a specific service, what could be relevant to show you here? And we got some of the same gauges here around what vulnerabilities are identified or the success rates. It could be what open pull requests exist. Also, there's something like release drift. So if I release a specific version of this service into one environment, but I don't push it further into production, I might forget about that and maybe want to visualize this. From this page, we also noted that we added a couple of different tabs at the top, just showing like what could other things be. And that could be around documentation, as we talked about previously. It could also be around the build of the test results, the release things, security monitoring. So just trying to set some ideas in the heads for those whom we presented this for, to figure out, could there maybe be something to discover or implement here. And the last ones I'm gonna just pull up here is a couple of widgets. We got some runtime events from maybe the Kubernetes platform. How is a rollup progressing, or is something crash looping? It could be how is the general deployment overviews of usage of resources like CPU and memory and stuff like that. So just different ideas around what could maybe be relevant to some. We are still focusing around backend developers at this point. So we tried to like figure out what could be answers that needed, questions that needed answering here in the beginning. And then of course, with these mockups in hand, we started to collect some feedback. And that is of course, back to the thing I've mentioned a couple of times now, we want to deliver the right thing. And we gotta admit it, no one gets hyped about your new thing that solves a rare edge case for almost no developers. So we want to build something that fixes an issue for the broader set of stakeholders. We don't want to fix something for a specific team in Lunar that might have a couple of developers that faces this issue. We don't want to start with that, because then we can't build any hype around this. What our expectations were is that if we can launch this Backstage installation and we can maybe hit, I don't know, 70, 80% of users would get value from it at the launch, people would get hyped around this and want to see what can it do more, instead of starting with the edge cases that might be easier to scope, but doesn't really make that hype at the start. So we had some ideas and we set out a poll and a presentation of the ideas internally at Lunar. And apologies for the next slide here, it's in Danish, but this is just a snippet of a Slack post that I posted in our internal Slack. And what we saw from this was that we had shortlisted a couple of features, 5 features, and we thought maybe these could be the ones that we should start off with. So I'm just gonna walk through a couple of them, or actually just mention 5 of them as it is in English, and see, and we can take the results. So the first thing we listed was this automatic service generation. So with a name and a description, click go, and we should be ready with a repository. We should be ready with a Docker registry. Possibly it should already be deployed into a test environment with a hello world application or something like that. So really just set everything up. So I don't, as a developer, need to know, I need to go into these different things and I need to follow these guides to get set up. This should be fully automatic for several reasons, but the most relevant one is to avoid new developers being in doubt if they do it right. If you provide them a long guide, they're going to be in doubt all the way through because they don't know anything about Lunar just yet. So just taking that out, that could be valuable. Next one was the squad overview that we also saw in the mockups. That was number 2. Then number 3 would be database access requests. So how can I get access to this specific database, or I want to maybe help customer support figuring out what has happened for this specific user. How can I get a nice way to get access to the data? 4th is release status. So what is the current release status of all the things that I own here in Lunar. It could be these drift concepts that I talked about, or maybe there's a couple of releases that is crashing in production or something like that. And then the fifth is the service catalog that we also saw that Backstage provided out of the box that could be valuable to us. And from the poll here in Slack, we saw that 11 developers hit number 5. So we knew from that point on, this was what's going to make the most value to the most developers as a first thing to implement. So next up was to make it fit. And what I mean by this is that products should match the expectations of the users, of course. And we want to align this product. And with this in mind, we don't want just yet another thing. May had plenty of tools in that great grand overview of all the different logos. We don't want to just add another Backstage logo to that. Instead, we want to make sure that this fits seamlessly into the rest of the platform that we built for developers. And I quoted Daniel Bryant here, who had a talk at the latest KubeCon he's from Ambassador Labs, and said, you can't have good developer experience without good user experience. And the point is that you can't just say that this is an internal system used by developers, so we shouldn't pay too much attention to the UX, because traditionally UX has been end users and developers has been internal. And well, let's admit it, most of us have created some internal tools that doesn't really look astonishing. So here we should maybe just spend some time on making sure that the developer experience is actually a good user experience. It could actually be nice if it looked good and was nice to work with, instead of just being yet another tool. At Lunar, we already had some tools in place. We use a project called Shuttle that we built to help us make it easy for developers to develop different services in different languages, but having the same place to go or the same way to do things. So what Shuttle can help us with is abstract the concept of the implementation language away, and then just make a clear cut around how do I make this build, just as an example. So if I pull down a Go project in Lunar, I can run a Shuttle command called shuttle run build, and it'll do the build without any dependencies to my machine. So I don't need the Go toolchain installed. I don't need to know which version this service was created with. Instead, I can rely on Shuttle having that figured out. The same goes with a Java service or something else. The thing around this is that it is built around a manifest, and it is YAML, of course, a manifest called shuttle.yaml. And the information that we've stored in here, without really recognizing it at first, is that we have quite a lot of good details around what this thing is, and who owns it, and how does it work, and what does it expect. So this is a snippet of a service called Deadletter. It is owned by the squad NASA. It is a Go project. We can see the builder image is a Golang image. It requires a database, and it serves ingress traffic. We can also see at the bottom line there, line 14, that it uses RabbitMQ. So these are actually some details that could be very valuable to collect. But this is decentralized. This is stored with the implementation of the service. So this is just a file in the root of the repository. But if we could get these information into Backstage somehow, that would be nice. So back to the point around not having yet another thing. We want Backstage not to serve as a thing where you register these things that you have. We all know how having a catalog on the side is doomed to become outdated from day one, because nobody's going to remember how to add things to this. And if I create a new service, I have to go over there and click a button that registers this component. Instead, we want the source of truth to be elsewhere. And from a developer's perspective, the source of truth, the existence of a service, is in the Git repository itself, hosting that service. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to import these sources of truth into Backstage. So if we find a Git repository in the Lunar organization at GitHub, and we can find the shuttle.yaml file in that repository, we have a lot of information around what we need to create the entities in Backstage as needed. So we had these 3 points we wanted to work with. We wanted to import the source of truth elsewhere. Another example of this is not the services, but the users, the developers themselves. So where is the canonical place to go to figure out who can commit code? Lunar, that is GitHub, because GitHub is where we host all our code. So if we can index the teams in GitHub and the users in each of these teams, we can now collect ownership. We know that I'm a member of the NASA organization, or the NASA team in GitHub. And from that, we can figure out that NASA owns these components. So now I own these components. So we wanted to achieve that to avoid having another thing that we had to keep up. Also, we are already quite focused on solving the right needs here. We don't want to do a lot of things, but we also don't want to require them to be in this. So this was an opt-in feature, and we wanted to make it something that we could provide without developers really knowing that it was going on. And lastly, we of course wanted to enable some DIY, because we are scaling tremendously. And maybe next year we got double the amount of the engineers here at Lunar, and the platform team would not be able at any way to help each of these developers create new things in Backstage. So we also wanted a way where we could help them help themselves to create new things. And we're gonna get back to a couple of examples of that, where teams have actually created new stuff into Backstage without us being part of it, except for helping out if there's something that we're in doubt of. But just short pausing here around the importing of source of truth. So as I said, Backstage is an application framework, and it helps us around building the application itself. But there's also a lot of great things packaged in there that helps us import these sources of truth. So these are 6 of the default processors that are shipped with Backstage itself. We can see here that we could import these teams and users from GitHub just by saying, here's the GitHub organization and here is the access credentials. And Backstage will figure out what users are in there, what teams do they be part of, and put that into the entity system of Backstage. The same goes for GitLab. The same goes for Azure DevOps or Bitbucket. Of course, if you adopt Backstage into an organization that might not have everything in like a central place, or maybe you have some file servers that stores these things or something like that, or at least some parts of the truth, you can use the more simple processes like the file reader that just points at a specific file somewhere that's available to the Backstage instance. So we have different handles here out of the gate that can help us import the sources of truth from elsewhere without having to build it ourselves. Specifically, what we did was that we used the GitHub organization plugin and processor to import the teams and the users, but we created a specific shuttle processor that was able to inspect these shuttle or YAML files, collect all the information around it, and categorize the entities based on that. So we could now figure out, here is a service, it's written in Go, it's owned by this team, it's called this name, it has this description, and we can then create the components in Backstage. I'm going to get back to a couple of examples of that when we see it. So now we know what we should build and to whom we should do it, and now it's just a matter of getting started. And as I just mentioned, the crowd here has a lot of things already. So we have a huge community in the Backstage area that helps each other building all of these different things. There's a great repository, an organization that just helps us. And as I think I missed to mention that Backstage is no longer a Spotify project, but instead a CNCF sandbox project, which just opens the community even more. And there's great discussions around the things and the needs you need to implement. So feel the crowd, be part of the community, and help each other, help yourselves and everyone else by open sourcing all the things you do. And already there's a lot of people already doing this, and it's fantastic to see. And as we're going to see just shortly, I'm going to go through the installation of Backstage that we have here in Lunar, and I'm going to point out which of these things are built by Lunar and which of these things are built by the community, because most of it is actually by the community. But of course, we need to be ourselves as well and do the things that fits Lunar specifically. So let's dive into how the instance actually is set up and what we have created. So first of all, let's talk about the catalog. We knew from the polls that we saw on Slack that this was the most valuable thing that we could provide up front. So that was what we started with. So here we have the main catalog. I have at this point selected the things that I own as a developer in NASA. So these are all components owned by Squad NASA. There are different things here, and there's a description. These things are all pulled from GitHub, and as I said, the shuttle preprocessor, which takes things like the description from the description in GitHub, because that's where developers would naturally go and add the description as well. We can also, in the upper left corner, select the dropdown that's currently set to all in the type dropdown. Instead, we can open it up and say, maybe I want to dive into only see the libraries. If this was May who needed to figure out how do we do logging in Go in Lunar, maybe she would go here, select the libraries, and search for the Golang tag and see what things do we have, and maybe filter it on log and see maybe there's a logging library in here that we could use out of the gate. If we click on one of these components, specifically I'm clicking on the dead letter service here, this is the next page. So this is how we present a service component in Lunar. The service is called dead letter, as it says in the upper left corner. It has the component service type. We present the README as it's also presented in GitHub. So this might look familiar to those familiar with the GitHub UI. On the right side, we have a couple of metadata things. We have links to the source of this. So you can view the source directly in GitHub if you just want to go to the source code. We can view the tech documentation that's relevant for this. There's some metadata around the type of it, the tags it has, and the ownership. Then the language it's implemented in, and all the contributors. At the bottom, there's some of the things we're starting to look into around the graphs, catalog graph plugin, but I'm going to get back to that later on. As you can see in the top, there's also these different tabs, and we also saw them in the mockups, but the words have changed slightly because we found out that we might not want to split up things like build and test. It was not really the way developers worked. They wouldn't consider these as separate things, but instead would consider them as a single CI/CD step where maybe the Jenkins results were shown. We can also see the pull requests for this specific service. And you could argue that you could just see this in GitHub, but now we have a central place where you could access this, but as this is not the source of truth of anything, you can also always go to the source of truth where you might want to collaborate on it. And if I click any of these pull requests, I'm also taken to GitHub. So that's nice. That enables some of the questions, or answers some of the questions could have when starting. Next up, as we saw from the website, the tech documentation was a very, very valuable thing. So on the left, we have a tech docs main navigation item that shows us just a list of all the documents. And here I've filtered around the things that I personally have starred. So these are the developer onboarding, the platform documentation that is internal NASA documentation, the service lifecycle document that describes from thought to production and how each of these stages are, what is relevant in each of them, and some technology guides like how do I create a new service. Spoiler, creating a new service in Lunar is just getting back to Backstage, so there's not really that much of a guide in that anymore. If we click one of these items, we can go to the dead letter service that we saw earlier on. This is the documentation. So this is some markdown that is hosted in the source, in the Git repository with the code, and we just pick it up and render it here in Backstage. It creates these table of contents on the right automatically, and we can have different documents with a tree structure on the left. We also have in-document search here. Also, all of this is part of the Backstage setup, which is very, very nice. Of course, we could also see these things directly on a specific service. So here I've selected the service manager component in Lunar, and we can see at the top that it's the docs tab that is selected here. So this is not a standalone document, but instead a document around this specific service. Moving on to another standalone document is the developer onboarding. And actually, I want to pause here and talk a bit about the developer onboarding experience in Lunar in general, because as we saw, May had to think about a lot of different technologies. And to make that easy, or at least make that comprehensible, we had to figure out a way to to maybe start with the basics and then just slowly add more and more. And what we started on here is that when you get a whole new laptop, you haven't done anything Lunar before, we have some things to enable this developer platform that needs to be set up. Specifically, a system like Shuttle needs to be configured on the machine up front. So this is a developer onboarding document. It's set up like a wizard where you step through each of these, do a couple of things, read a couple of documents, or just paragraphs, because we don't want this to be any lengthy thing to go through, but just instead give you the absolute minimum things required for you as a developer to get set and start developing. And the goal in Lunar and in the development platform is that on your first day, you should be able to deploy to production right away. We don't want to spend weeks on this because that is wasteful. We want to release to production at day one. If we haven't achieved that, if developers are faced with long delays or don't know how to set things up, we have failed, and we need to fix that, because that is, with this growth that we are seeing, this is paramount for the success of the company. All right, back to the instance of Backstage. So the API docs, it's much of the same, more of the same. It's a table with all the APIs that's served. Here we can see that NASA owns 2 APIs. It's 2 HTTP APIs. And if I dive into one of these, it's dead letter again. I can see a nice Swagger UI representation of the API. I can discover how do I use this. Back to May's questions around then what? How can I do? What can I do with it? Of course, API documentation is not limited at all to Swagger. Swagger specification or OpenAI specifications. It could be GraphQL. It could be protobuf messages or gRPC and stuff like that. So there's different components we can take down from the community to help us. Lastly, we have the software templates, where I'm just going to show you a couple of shots around how you create a new service in Lunar. So the first is, again, the index of it. We have 4 templates configured at the moment, setting up a Go service with 2 different application frameworks, and we have some infrastructure service stuff and a Go library. If you click on one of these Go service things, this is all that needs to be input. The name of the service, a short description, and the ownership. And then you can, if you want to, set up auto-release policies up front. That means whenever you merge to the main branch of this repository that is created for you, we will automatically release that service into a given environment. So in this case, we are releasing it into the dev and staging environments. So all of this is open source, community-based plugins and components. We haven't done anything specifically Lunar to set this up, except the Lunar shuttle processor, as I mentioned. So of course, we also want to enable these customized things. So we need to make it us, we need to make it you. And good thing, Backstage is built upon React, which is a front-end framework. And with that, they have built a lot of great components to get you off the ground fast. So if you go to backstage.io/storybook, you'll find this nice index of standard Backstage components that you can take into your different plugins and use. So you don't have to figure out how do I create a gauge in React and make it react correctly to these different data sets. Instead, you can just take something down or create a graph or a paragraph or a card or whatever. There's all sorts of things. What we have built here in NASA is the dead letter system. So the dead letter system is a system that if a service is unable to handle a specific asynchronous message, we will offload it to a centralized location where we can index it. And from there on, developers can dive into Backstage, figure out what was the error, where was the source of the message, and should I redeliver it later on when I'm triaging this, or can it just be dropped because it might be a timely message that is no longer relevant? So this is the main entry point for the whole Lunar organization. You can see here the different squads and how many messages they have. Someone have been naughty in the squad Gemini with 43,000 messages waiting. Good thing this is the dev environment. If we dive into squad Gemini, we see another table, and now we're at the service level. We can now see that squad Gemini has these different services and with these number of messages in each. And if we dive further into that, we see another table. And in here, we can see the timestamp of the event. We can see the queue that it was consumed from with the what routing key in RabbitMQ. We can see the message ID and correlation IDs that might be relevant to figure out what happened, and then the error that caused this message to be offloaded to the dead letter system. There's also a small link at the right for a Humio query. So I'll take us directly into the Humio setup that we have in Lunar with a query that matches the time range around this message and all relevant parties of this message. So if the correlation ID has traversed several services, we can see the whole picture in one click. And if the developer looks into this triaging and figure out, well, these should just be delete, she will select these two, click the confirm delete button, and the messages will disappear. So that's an example of what we can do to fit our own needs. And these are built with standard components from the storybook that we saw earlier, and standard Backstage components in general. Yeah, so I think that was it around this, and then let's look into the next steps. So we decided to start with backend developers because we saw the most pains were around those people who needed to figure out how they can enable themselves to deliver the products that we need in Lunar. But of course, there are a lot of stakeholders that we didn't select then. So the next steps for us would be to discover, well, who might the next group of people in Lunar be that we could enable. So this could be maybe some of them, some of the titles we already saw early on. It might be web developers who want to get some insights into staging deployments, or maybe performance analytics around the websites that they release, maybe with the Lighthouse plugin that is available in the community. It could be data analytics who want to work with AI models or data transformation pipelines and training data to maybe visualize how data is handled or transformed. It could be these auditors who want to see where is specific documentation on, say, game days that validates that something is as it should be, or how many vulnerabilities that's currently found across all of the software, and which one of these that are relevant. It could be architects who want to see the domain boundaries of what of all these services communicate with what, and maybe we should either change ownership or change some dependencies to avoid having this large spider web of communications. Or it could be mobile developers who wants to have some insights into the state rollouts in iOS, or maybe some usage statistics, who knows. And that would be the next steps for us to start interviewing different stakeholders and figure out where can we do it. Good thing we still have this list of pains that we collect, so we already have a good idea about where we can set it next. And as I shortly mentioned, when we looked at one of the services landing pages, we saw a small graph in the lower right corner, and that is the catalog graph plugin. So Backstage is built around entities. So you can register a component or a group or a user or an API, so different entities. And all of these entities can have relationships to each other. So in this view, I have selected the Squad NASA group that was collected from GitHub. And we can also see each of the members of the Squad NASA group here. So this is just one way of showing this. This could also be all the services that Squad NASA owns, or we could look at who consumes and provides this specific API. So this is the small steps around figuring out how we can present this to architects around what is communicating with what and who is responsible for what, to maybe set some clear domain boundaries of things. Another idea that we've explored is around if we could tag some of these asynchronous messages in a nice way. So say that I have this user-created message. This is written in a protobuf language, so it's a language agnostic definition. If we could take this message and we could put it into Backstage, and we knew who consumes this message and who publishes this message, we can now draw the lines of all the asynchronous message dependencies. So these are not critical dependencies at a runtime level. No users is going to be waiting for it because it's asynchronous in nature. But what we could do, or what at least we could imagine, is that if we could tag, say, a social security number as GDPR sensitive, now we in Backstage know that any consumer of this message is actually handling a field that contains GDPR sensitive material. So this can help auditors to figure out where is this information stored. And we can also track the relationships of all these information and give a ground overview of where is everything stored or who is handling what. So that's just some of the ideas that we're looking into in Backstage. So as the last reflection before I turn the mic back to Kasper is, did it actually work? So if we look back now, a couple of years, we have seen a huge growth in engineering, and we have not seen a huge growth in the platform engineering team. And that is, to me, one of the major indicators that this worked. Developers are more happy than they were before. They can find what they need. They know the entry point where to look for getting answers to questions. They can create their own systems. They can document their stuff so it's automatically indexed and available to everyone. And lastly, we as a platform team is able to sustain this growth and really be able to help them. And as soon as we find a question that we can't answer, we will think to ourselves, where could we put this into Backstage where it would naturally come up, say the onboarding documentation or the service lifecycle document that describes this stage of development. So those are definitely indicators that this worked, and Backstage has lifted a huge amount of work off our hands to be able to not build this ourselves, but instead leverage everything from the community. So shout out to the Backstage team and all the things that they do, and also to Spotify from actually making it possible to use this fantastic tool. So that was all for now. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for joining us to the live stream today instead of Wednesday when all the tech failed us. So yeah, that was it for me.
Thank you, Bjørn. I hope my sound is working.
It is.
It is. That is awesome. Enough with all the technical issues, hopefully. So, well, yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. We do have a couple of questions, and we do have a little bit of time left. So Laszlo asks, he has a couple of questions, but he asks, you call Backstage an application framework. Reading the docs, it feels so you have to put Backstage together in JavaScript. How much effort was it all together for you so far?
Yeah, great question. So I think one of the benefits here is that we already had a React application running in Lunar. So our back office system is made in React. So we had some knowledge around React. And yes, it is written in JavaScript or in the TypeScript variant. So you get some compiler help or transpiler help. But yeah, there is some work to do. But the amount of custom implementation that we have built in TypeScript or JavaScript is insignificant, or at least in my opinion. Because let's say this shuttle preprocessor that I talked about, that'll scrape Git repositories, find the shuttle.yaml file, and put it into Backstage. That's maybe, 150 lines of code. That's it. Because the Backstage application framework makes it easy enough to say, if you see a location that points to this GitHub organization, let me know and I'll do some checks on that repository and decide if this results in, say, an API was discovered or a documentation site was discovered. So it's a pretty low investment, at least to me. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, because what is the alternative, I guess?
Definitely. And that's a good point, because if we had to build all this ourselves, I don't care if I had to write it in Go. This would take me months to achieve. So that would be very, very tough for me, at least. So this has been an enabler for us, definitely.
He then follows up with another question. Are you afraid or have experienced the Jenkins problem or WordPress problem with Backstage? Meaning there are or will be many plugins out there with varied quality.
Yeah, I guess this will always be the case, and I think it's kind of in the nature of building open systems like this. To my knowledge, or at least to my experience so far, we have seen some great quality plugins from different sites. But as it is with all open source, we are not entitled to require any quality here. But if we want to, we can reach out to some of the service providers that do this for a living, say Roadie.io, who's going to have hosted Backstage instances with a lot of internal plugins that they develop, and here is a team that provides this, much like you have it with Jenkins. So we can't be spared of low quality plugins, but the least we can do is try either to improve the quality of the plugins or start paying for it, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. So I think that is the questions that are in the chat so far. So if you have any last questions, please write them right away. In the meantime, I will ask a question that I wrote down myself. I think you talked about building hype and starting a movement internally. It's a really interesting topic. Did you also? So you were a pretty early adopter of Backstage. Was it always this easy or to get this movement started, or how was sort of that creation of that movement internally?
Yeah,
talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely, great question. So yeah, I think there's two perspectives of it. There was the adoption story of the technology itself. Let's just be honest, it was pretty rough in the beginning because we adopted it in the very early days. Great thing is that the core maintainers have created this stability index where we can just get some idea what we can expect from the different plugins. So that also addresses one of Laszlo's points around fragmented UI experiences and what can we actually expect of these things. But that set aside, the technology set aside, just building this hype internally and figuring out if this actually provided value. It was a great journey, I think, and it built upon some of all the cultural things that we've been working on in Lunar over the years. As I mentioned, these developer pains, that was a natural extension of these things to be able to start solving larger problems or the fragmented answers to all the problems and start collecting them. So people were getting hyped quite fast, and I think that the internal presentations and the interviews we've done with different teams have really helped us nail what we needed to do up front instead of creating, as I also said in the presentation, the wrong thing at first, because we want to have this hype. We want to make the organization back up in this instead of having to create this and force people to use it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. You're also tapping into this concept of treating your platform as a product, right? Because going out there, interviewing the developers, what is the actual need, and then focusing on that is also what we see in the general community these days, is to treat your platform as a product.
Yeah, definitely. And you have to do it. Otherwise you just create that another logo at the great grand set of logos that may have to try to understand. So
yeah,
have to be there.
And if you look at the CNCF landscape, there's a lot of logos you could pull down. And
that's the easy one to point fingers at. But I think it's you have to keep in mind that you can't just throw new solutions in there, because that in itself is not going to solve anything. You got to think holistically around all the things that we provide as a platform team has to fit together some way or another.
Yeah. Last question, and this is just me again because there's no more questions in the chat. Could you maybe put some words into how do you see any sort of movement here around the developer experience and sort of the local development experience that has been an issue over the past couple of years with Kubernetes? How can Backstage help in sort of creating a better developer experience locally on your machine or into a Kubernetes cluster or in general? Yeah, how do you see that?
Well, I think Backstage is not like it's in itself. It doesn't really solve that, but it has the tools required to do it. I think it has the potential to becoming, say, more like a developer control plane kind of thing, where developers interact more with the systems that they're working on. But I think it kind of depends on the specific issues, because just adding Kubernetes into an organization and adding Backstage on the side of it and saying, well, now we have a cloud native setup where we can deploy things into Kubernetes. Backstage is not going to solve any of that. And so as we saw it with the catalog, in itself, it doesn't provide any value. It's more how you tie it into the existing things, or how you tie it into something like telepresence from Ambassador Labs. Could Backstage be a front end to manage how your local application is running inside an external cluster or something like that.
Yeah. Thank you, Bjørn. We actually got one last question in, and I'll just have that, and then we will round this off. So the question is this tool replacing others now or in the future?
Yes, I definitely think it does. So of course, it depends on what tools you have in the first place. But it's not like Backstage can't replace Jenkins because there are different products, but it might replace the front-end experience, the UI of Jenkins. It might be able to do something more holistic around the application instead of just being branches and builds. And same goes for other stuff like documentation size. If you use Confluence to have documentation, maybe it would replace that usage and use it into Backstage and stuff instead, and use the TechDocs engine for it. But it also, of course, depends on the different stakeholders of those tools. So you can't move Confluence documentation into Backstage and expect every product person in the company to start writing Markdown. That doesn't fit. So it has to be according to the stakeholders.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Bjørn, for doing a repeat today of Wednesday's event. And this time we managed to get the recording through. I at least see a lot of comments in the chat, so that indicates you managed to get this done. So with that, I just want to throw this up on the screen once more. I just want to wish you all happy holidays, and thank you for being part of this community, and thank you for joining today. And with that, yeah, happy holidays and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the questions.